I'd like to dedicate my contribution to this debate tonight to the memory of Dr. Al Lewis, scholar, activist, artist, and humanist. Most of you know him as Grandpa Al, but Grandpa Al's life demonstrated all tough Brooklyn Jews didn't become gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, or athletes like the great fighter Bonnie Ross, or political reactionaries like Norman Podhoretz. Some chose the path of progressive struggle taken by such great radical intellectual activists as Sidney Kaplan, Herbert Aptek, and Jack Newfield, men from whom I learned much. Thus, I believe that I speak for that tribe of oppositional voices who follow Grandpa's example when I say that now, like when Tolstoy died, we are all orphans. When I was originally asked, the theme of my polemic is the Iraq War is criminal folly. Now, when I say folly, I'm basing this on the concept of folly as presented in the book The March of Folly by Barbara Tuchman, the two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, which means that when a great nation pursues a policy which is demonstrably not in its best interest. The Iraq War is criminal folly. When I was originally approached about debating the wisdom and justice of the war in Iraq, I was hesitant, because I thought anybody who at this late stage of the game was willing to defend such a criminal war, which by some respectable estimates has slaughtered up to 200,000 innocent Iraqi civilians while reducing their country to ruin, and caused the death of over 2,200 young American men and women while leaving more than 50,000 mentally and physically impaired for life, squandering hundreds of billions of dollars of the nation's treasure, 440 billion thus far. And Professor Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist at Columbia, says this could cost $2 trillion before it's all over. I surmise that in either case, that such a person would either be a charlatan, a fool, or a narrow-minded fanatic. And I surmise that in either case, I would be placing myself in an untenable situation, because a charlatan will say anything to win an argument. And my grandfather long ago warned me to never argue with a fool, because the people looking on can't tell who's who. However, to my joy and delight, the opponent they had in mind has turned out to be far from a fool, and he shall soon reveal if he's an unthinking fanatic. And I shall leave it to the audience to decide if he's a charlatan. On that question, your guess is as good as mine. He seems like a nice guy. What is not in question, however, is that Mr. Hitchens is an intellectual of international stature, a cosmopolite and bon vivant, a man who has been declared one of the finest minds of our time, an Oxford man and celebrated scribe, an heir to the tradition of Chaucer and Shakespeare, a child of empire who embodies the highest cultural achievement of that sceptred isle with the unmitigated audacity to call itself Great Britain. And thus tonight, he presents us with a living paradox, a walking oxymoron, a learned man on a fool's errand. And as befits his mission, Mr. Hitchens has chosen to make his stand on sinking intellectual sands. In any case, it is a propitious moment for this debate, because it is the beginning of African American History Month, a time when the world is viewed through the eyes of black folk, a counter-vision of reality that makes some white folk nervous and terrorizes others, because it calls into question the moral conceits of modern European civilization and the myth of American exceptionalism on such questions as freedom, justice, and equality. Like the great African American historian Dr. Benjamin Quarles, author of the seminal study, The Negro and American Revolution, I believe that those who wish to understand the full complexity of contemporary events need to add a dimension of historical perspective. The source of my unique take on events was explained by Dr. W.B. Du Bois, the most broadly learned, prophetic, and consequential American humanist intellectual of the 20th century, who observed in his 1903 masterpiece, The Souls of Black Folk, the Negro is the seventh son of a seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with a second sight in this American world. I will analyze the war tonight from that second sight. Furthermore, Dr. Du Bois had already conceptualized the general problem posed by Iraq in an earlier speech given at the first Pan-African Congress held in London during 1900. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, he declared. The question as to how far differences of race are going to be made hereafter, the basis of denying to over half the world the right to sharing to their utmost ability the opportunities and privileges of modern civilization. And in the case, the world must needs remember that in this age when the ends of the world are being brought so near together, The millions of black men in Africa, America, and the islands of the sea, not to speak of the brown and yellow myriads elsewhere, are bound to have great influence upon the world in the future by reason of sheer numbers and physical contact. After pointing out that if the all-powerful Europeans promoted the peaceful development of the colored nations, it would redound to the good of the world community, Dr. Du Bois goes on to observe, but if by reason of carelessness, prejudice, greed, and injustice, the black world is to be exploited and ravished and degraded, the results must be deplorable, if not fatal, not simply to them, but to the high ideals of justice, freedom, and culture which 1,000 years of Christian civilization have held before Europe. This was a prophetic statement indeed, because the Islamic jihadists today are best understood as a response to the myriad European sins that Dr. Du Bois warned against a century ago. In political terms, Iraq represents a failed British neo-colonial experiment with a Bush administration high on hubris has tried to salvage by remaking it to an American recipe, just as the disaster in Vietnam 40 years ago represents a U.S. attempt to save a failed French colonial project. And while there are many differences between these two conflicts, they have much in common, the most obvious of which is that they were directed by misguided macho Texas cowboys. It is into the motion of a bloodstained history of Western imperialism, with its maze-like twists and turns and cul-de-sacs, which the Bushmen and their apologists have wandered without a functional compass. And it is abundantly clear that Murphy's Law is in full effect here. Everything that can go wrong has gone wrong and will go wrong in this war born of high crimes and misdemeanors. Thus, I shall summarize my opposition to the war of aggression in 9 points, which will form the basis of my argument tonight. I oppose the war because it cannot believe that an event. First of all, I oppose the war because it is a violation of international law, and the most grievous instance of a tendency on the part of the Bush administration to trash the machinery of international order and cooperation. That includes unsigning the International Criminal Court Treaty, which looks like a prescient move in retrospect since he would now be facing indictment, scrapping the Kyoto Agreement on saving environment, and moving to unilaterally abrogate the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the greatest diplomatic achievement of the nuclear age. Taken together, these policies have made the world a more dangerous and unstable place because they threaten the existence of all life on this planet. Furthermore, I oppose the war because I cannot believe that an event conceived with evil intent can produce a righteous income. I oppose the war because the invasion of Iraq is hindering the war on terror. It is recruiting far more terrorists than the American military is killing or can kill. Thus, it is promoting, not stopping, the wider war on terror. I oppose the war because democratic government cannot be exploited by armed invaders. And I abhor the willingness to kill or cause the deaths of tens of thousands of innocent Iraqi civilians and dismiss the slaughter of innocents with the soulless term collateral damage, which I first heard when the Iraqi war veteran Timothy McVeigh used it to justify blowing up a building with child care day centers in it just to get at his real targets in the federal government. I believe this policy is as much a capital crime when committed in Iraq as in Oklahoma. And to argue otherwise is has that grinning charlatan John McCain who talks out of both sides of his mouth, and that shameless hussy Condoleezza Rice, the wicked witch of the West, is to promote racism and chauvinism of the sort that the Nazis promoted. I oppose the war in Iraq because it's not only morally bankrupt as foreign policy, but incompetent in strategy. I oppose the war in Iraq because it is being fought on the backs of the poor. George II, errand boy of the plutocrats, has asked no sacrifice from the running partners of who own the nation's wealth. In fact, braggadocious buffoon that he is, he can be seen in Michael Moore's brilliant documentary Fahrenheit 9/11, which my man here don't like, bragging about being one of the haves and have-mores, and he tells them in any extraordinary display of hubris, some people call you elite, I call you my base. So I'm going thus I finally oppose the war because I cannot fathom how an administration that has been given a failing grade on preparedness on the home front by the 9/11 Commission can ensure the security of Iraq, especially now that they have admittedly converted into the front lines in the battle against the Islamic jihadists. Like the old blues man said, the whole world is in trouble and the danger zone is everywhere as a result of their policies. So I will finally end with this. Addressing an assemblage of white Americans, Frederick Douglass, the incredibly eloquent and learned abolitionist, essayist, ex-slave, on the 4th of July in 1841, to a completely white audience, he said this, and of course I'm going to repeat it now because I believe that if you put this question to the Islamic jihadists, or all the people in the Islamic world who consider themselves to be opposing American imperialism, I think that this would be their response. If you were to ask them the question, what does America's self-designation as the citadel of freedom and democracy mean to you? They would reply, like Frederick Douglass, who was speaking on behalf of African-American slaves, to him your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity, your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your denunciation of tyrants brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality hollow mockery, your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgiving, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy's thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace the nation of savages. There's not a nation of the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour, end of quote. And I think that's an excellent description of American policy in Iraq tonight.
We ought to hold the applause till the end. Isn't that what they always say?
No, man.
How many debates have you been to?
This is the second fight I'm talking about. You know, y'all clap whenever you want it. You know what I mean? This is like church. Clap whenever you want it. All right?
Mr. Hitchens.
No. All praise belongs to Allah. I think I can see what's in store for me, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, comrades and friends. Yet another soiree of humiliation. Beginning by not just being out-talked, out-pointed in point of precedence. Some people from Oxford are very sensitive about who speaks first, fortunately. And out-argued, and above all, perhaps outdressed. I have the feeling that many of you here would like to begin an inquest upon Iraq policy, if there's going to be one, which there clearly is, approximately in 2002, and as it were, put it all on the Bush administration. And while I know that that's what you'd like, I'm not going to allow you to have it. So I know I'm not going to get any applause. I was right about that. The fact of the matter is, and I think it's the beginning of wisdom as well as the beginning of responsibility, that our involvement with Iraq, ours as a people as well as a state, goes back a lot longer than that and has stuck us with some responsibilities from which we are not entitled to walk away. I'm not sure where I would date the beginning of this commitment, this mutual relationship we have with the Iraqi people, but it couldn't be any later than September or so 1979, early 1980, when President Jimmy Carter, the great human rights Baptist person, gave Saddam Hussein American permission for an invasion of Iran, which we think cost 1.5 million lives of young men on both sides, probably more. If you want to talk about collateral damage and civilian casualties, see how the Muslims love each other when they go to war, especially in the name of God, and see what a hecatomb was wrought by the good intentions of American liberals on that occasion, and what a debt we have incurred. I would date it a little earlier if I could, I think, to the role boastfully played by the Central Intelligence Agency in the coup that brought Saddam Hussein to power in the first place. But if we were to not take this back into the prehistory of our generation, the latest we can begin scrutiny is 1991, with the emancipation of the Kuwaiti people from their annexation as the 19th province of a fascist state by Saddam Hussein. Not the invasion of Kuwait, as it's sometimes falsely stated, but the abolition of Kuwait, the obliteration of Kuwait. The removal of a member state of the United Nations, of the Arab League, and of the non-aligned movement, and its full possession by another power, by sheer force of arms. Saddam Hussein has only ever made, in the course of his career, one self-criticism, and it was this. He said, I wish I had got the nuclear bomb before I invaded Kuwait, because then they couldn't have got me out of there. You have to realize that in 1991 we didn't know it, but he had the choice of which he got first. It's fortunate for us that he was not a rational actor, but it was a demented one. If he had got Kuwait, he'd have been very easily possessed of the resources to finish the reactor, which the French had so helpfully begun building for him, and to dictate terms to us. And there would have been nothing amusing about that, either for us or the neighbors of Iraq in the region. That's what we skipped through no luck or rather no credit, only by luck, no credit to our own statecraft or our own intelligence. Now, since that date, and since the eviction of Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, there has been a very careful, scrupulous, ruthless, hard-fought debate, which all of you, if you don't know about, should have educated yourselves about. Not conducted just in Washington, but in learned journals and on the internet and in public forums, going on for about 12 years. So the debate was this: were we right to confirm and leave Saddam Hussein in power after his eviction from Kuwait, re-establish him in effect in power, watch with our own military superiority as we gave his own helicopter gunships permission to re-establish control, a genocidal, fascistic control over the Iraqi people? Was that the right decision or not? And was, because it entails this too, was it right to put the Iraqi people under 12 years of suffering and misery and damage of sanctions, while the Saddam Hussein regime was able to build one palace in every single province remaining, the other 18 provinces of Iraq, dedicated to the wealth of a psychopathic and sadistic crime family? Was that the right decision or not? Many of us came soberly, but firmly to the conclusion that that had been wrongly decided. Saddam Hussein should have been removed from power in Iraq in 1992. And we've been looking, some of us, for an administration that would face this fact. And it was, whenever any administration was going to come to power that was going to be capable of facing this fact, we would have to admit that it was going to be too little and too late, and probably botched by definition. But that we had to cancel the shame of prolonging the wretched experience of having Iraq governed by by a government that has, I'll do this quickly, broken all the four conditions under which state sovereignty is sacrificed by international law. International law, sir.
Let me just say
these
this.
four conditions.
That's what the United Nations decide.
These four.
Can you?
These four conditions.
You know,
these
12 minutes.
I'm speaking back.
These four conditions, in point of fact, are adumbrated by the United Nations, and they comprise the following: if a state conducts aggression or annexation of territory of neighboring states repeatedly, as Iraq had done with Iran and Kuwait, if it does that, it puts itself outside the law, qualifies its sovereignty. That's a UN decision, not mine. If it violates the Genocide Convention, in other words, undertakes the destruction of a whole people within its borders or outside them, as was done in Iraqi Kurdistan, all countries that sign the Genocide Convention, which is the majority now and includes our own government, are obliged by law to intervene either to prevent, or if they cannot prevent, to punish the attempted genocide. The third condition is lying to inspectors about the Non-Proliferation Treaty, any violation, in fact, of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, any fooling around with or promiscuous use of, let alone, weapons of mass destruction. And the fourth is giving aid, comfort, support, and material aid to international gangster groups who target civilians. Iraq is multiply guilty on all those four conditions, as I will hope I don't have to illustrate to you. I'll take these as assertions uncontradicted so far. I will accept any challenge on them. This is a very grave state of affairs and had gone on for very much too long, and the Iraqi people were suffering what have to be called very serious civilian casualties as a result of the decision to leave that regime in power and to punish only the citizens of the country. The figures, I think, may have been exaggerated, but there's no doubt that many tens of thousands of needless deaths of Iraqi children were recorded as a result of the denial of medicine, of clean water, of food, and of other basic necessities, as well as many other older Iraqis. The figure, however large or small it is a terrifying one to contemplate. Well, we've lifted the sanctions now and punished the regime instead. And it seems to me it was about time that that policy reversal took place. And the case for that was absolutely complete in 1998, when the Senate passed the Iraq Liberation Act without a single dissenting voice, that it shall be the policy of the United States to move Iraq into a post-Saddam Hussein era. A very sane, publicly debated, well-considered policy that received Senate ratification after the ventilation of an enormous amount of evidence. In other words, there's no need to confuse this with matters such as jihad. You'll tell me, Mr. Wolf, when I've trespassed on the audience's time, won't you? Perhaps another couple of minutes. Could you stand the drone any longer than that? What's the clapping for, I wonder? The decision to reverse American policy and to decide to be the emancipator of the Iraqi people, to help them write a constitution, to protect them from fascist attacks while they had a democratic election, to attempt to federalize the differences between them, which can otherwise only be solved by civil war or partition or dictatorship. This is a very honorable thing the United States has done and is doing with its allies. And it's a nice change to be doing that to liberate the people and lock up the dictator. Obviously, some of you preferred it the other way around, or were happier when it was that way, or think Saddam Hussein was framed up, perhaps. I love it when people say that a serial criminal has somehow been unjustly accused. Well, we'll get to that, I've no doubt. But my macro point hasn't come yet. Not only is that a great thing in change of policy, in my opinion, the greatest change in policy of a sitting administration since Ronald Reagan decided that mutual assured destruction was both immoral and unstable. A huge decision that was, again, very, very much missed, including by me, I have to say, at the time. A decision of immense significance for the region and for us and for our future responsibilities in confronting a very deadly foe. So what I think I find, oddly enough, in Dr. Playthell's extremely eloquent and touching address was, despite his many references to the great dramas of history and the struggle for liberty, that he should miss so much the way in which this is a historical struggle for us too, and by some Hegelian alchemy that I'm still trying to analyze properly, the United States has managed to get itself, long overdue, on the right side of history in the region and deserves support in having done so. Thanks awfully. Bye.
At first,
let me sum up. The war is a crime. The war is just. What I want to do is try to change the terms of this discussion. When I let you, you can. Because in these things, the twain will never meet here. But if we start to talk, ask if the war is sensible, practical, logical, sustainable, winnable, we actually might move this discussion a bit forward. Mr. Benjamin, hypothetically, what's a good war? Tell me a positive outcome of this, something that you would think, certain events which would transpire in which you would say, damn, not bad.
I'd rather answer what he said. Really? You
No,
know
no.
First of all, let me just say this, man.
You got to ask.
Let me just. I would rather respond.
No,
to
I
him.
will
Right,
again.
Look.
Again,
let me just say,
listen.
the last good war I saw that this country was involved in was World War II. All right, that's the last good war I saw. And why? I mean, it doesn't take a genius to figure out why. I mean, we were confronted with a fascist maniac who really could conquer the world. I mean, Saddam Hussein. See, I don't really give a, I mean, look, so to talk about that Saddam Hussein was a danger to us, it's nonsense. You know, I mean, it's nonsense from every point of view. And if you give me a chance to talk, I'll show you it's nonsense, all right? But Adolf Hitler really did have the means to conquer the world.
Mr. Benjamin, again, functioning in I'm not asking what you believe. I'm just asking you to think in this in hypothetical terms. What if democracy were to come to Iraq? No, this may be unlikely. To me, it's unlikely. But what if democracy and a new level of prosperity were to come?
All right, Mr. Wolf, let me just say this. I'm surprised that my opponent, who makes a big deal out of being an atheist, right, which is something we share, even though I don't know if you're a real atheist, you see, because the only way you can tell if you're a real atheist is if you, like, for instance, the high seas test. If you're on a ship that you think is going to sink and you still don't swim. I was on the ship, the SS Colorado, Texaco, Colorado, that we thought was going to sink right off Galveston, Texas, and everybody was praying with me. So I'm a real atheist. But I don't wear, but I recognize the marvelous things the church do. But the thing that fascinates me is that as a proclaimed atheist, you're willing to engage in faith-based analysis. That's what he's engaged in. There's no evidence to make me believe that there's going to be any democracy in Iraq. What I see in Iraq, first of all, let me say this.
If there were,
hold on. If a frog had wings, his ass wouldn't hit the ground when he hopped. I don't believe that there's going to be any democracy in Iraq. I think it's nonsense.
Okay, well, let's see if you won't or can't create that hypothetical. Let's try it from the other side.
Well, let me just say this, man. You know, you're really too busy to be the
Christopher,
what a moderator is supposed to do. You're too busy.
Christopher, the worst possible situation, a set of events that would make you say, oh my God, this was a mistake.
Well, I shan't dodge the grammar of your question, but if you understood what I said to begin with, I said that the case for change de régime, not a faith-based point at all, in Iraq was complete on its own terms by 1998, and there was no alternative to it. Or rather, there were alternatives. I'll just quickly say what they would be. The implosion of Iraqi society, which was run by divide and rule between Shia and Sunni confessional Muslims, and genocide in respect of the large Kurdish minority. The implosion of Iraqi society becoming the collapse into a Ceausescu mania that was already very obvious of the Saddam Hussein regime itself and his own personality. The charming competition that would have been between his two delightful sons who die in Qusay. And the certainty that this implosion in Iraq, not unlike what happened in Afghanistan, would have led to an invasion, but not by the United States and Great Britain, but by Turkey, by Saudi Arabia, and by Iran, each of them intervening on the side of the most extreme of their co-religionists or political supporters. It would have been, in other words, something like what the Congo now is for West Africa.
What I'm trying to do is
we'd still have had to do something about it under enormously more difficult conditions and with gigantically greater loss of life.
Did you say we could stop each other?
No,
you said that in the beginning, right?
So, well, wait, no.
Yeah.
I'm sorry for a long.
I'm just curious to know.
I'm sorry for a long throat clearing, but yes, I can imagine. I wake up every morning thinking, what if we've gone in too late? What if this all goes wrong? What if Zarqawi's people can't be beaten? What if Shia sectarianism takes over the Shia vote? What if it's all too late and it goes south? Well, you should worry about this as much as I do.
Okay,
you wouldn't be spectators to that, ladies and gentlemen.
Under that circumstance, just let me clarify.
You have to hope that doesn't happen.
If that is the case, let's put it in terms of American resources. If it goes to, as it did in Vietnam, which we will return to, 50,000 lives, at what point do you say, this was a mistake, we just can't afford it, and woe that we could undo it?
Well, I was at the opening of the Vietnam Memorial in Washington when it was still a ditch of mud and just those wonderful stones from Ling, and I shall never forget the day I went, and walking along the wall and tracing all the names, which, as you know, are chronological, not alphabetical. And the first one, or two or three, as you perhaps don't know unless you visited, is from 1954, when no one even knew the United States was in Vietnam, except Colonel Lansdale and his CIA backers. And to realizing then, that's what being lied into war is like. I think every single casualty in that war, I'm so sorry. It's hell to talk and realize that no one's been listening. Or understanding a single bloody word one said, but in my opinion, I'll condense then. Every single life lost in that war is the result of, I agree with Dr. Benjamin about this, a criminal and illegal attempt to prolong the life of French colonialism in Indochina. If anyone can fail to see the difference between that and trying to rescue Iraq from implosion and help it to establish a federal democracy, as well as to disarm it, then I'm sorry, I think that all distinctions must have been thrown overboard. Well said.
Mr. Benjamin, would you like to respond? Sir, would you like to respond?
Yeah, there's one thing I'd like to say. I want all y'all to hear this, right? I got a radio show. I'd like to invite you to my radio show where you and I can go head to head without this guy. Okay. 2 hours, all right? You hear me? Me and him. I'd love to go because I came rigorously prepared. You know what I'm saying? For a serious argument. Look. He began talking about Kuwait, right? Well, you see, I'm the kind of writer that has been fired by the right and the left. I get fired all the time by stuff I write, right? Now, he manages to piss everybody off and still get paid. But I get fired. You understand what I'm saying? White folks, I have a hard time. So, all right, so the thing is, is that when I listen to him talk about Kuwait, right? One of the times when I was fired, I'm a member of DC 9. I'm a painter. 9 of my brothers got killed up there in the World Trade Center. I belong to District Council 18, and when I'm not writing, I go paint, right? But one of the jobs I had was building the quarters of the Emir of Kuwait, right over here on 44th Street, right across from the United Nations. I worked in building his easiest job I had to make Grand Theft Auto, didn't do nothing, just went around because they had all this fine wood in there, right? Let me tell you, this guy had a chandelier worth $1.5 million. I have one of the flowers out of it on right now on my table in my house. I don't give a damn about Kuwait, okay? I wouldn't care. The only reason that I opposed the invasion of Kuwait was for the same reason why I opposed the American invasion of Iraq. Because I believe it is dangerous to set a precedent where any nation thinks that it has the right to invade another nation because they disagree with their system. Let me show you how dangerous that is. And again, I told you in the beginning that I was going to look at this thing from the second sight. That is from being a black American. I know most white folks think we just, white people with a tan, but it ain't true. We represent a whole different experience and we look at things differently. Now, when he talks about, I'm worried about democracy in America, not democracy in Iraq. You understand what I'm saying? This nation here, hold on a minute, this nation here, do you know how many times this nation invaded each other? And the thing is that there's never been a country who suffers from historical amnesia the way this country does. I mean, white Americans can get to talking and they get all excited about this is the greatest country, we've stood for freedom for everybody. Listen, this country invaded other nations 112 times in the 20th century. 112 times in the 20th century. How many invasions have you witnessed? Panama. Instead of saying, what's the little island down there that they invaded? Grenada. Everybody is Michael Moore is exactly right when he say white folks in America feel like everybody is after them. Look, let me tell you what I think about this war, right? And if I have the time, I will demonstrate to you. I don't just think this. There are two things I came here tonight to demonstrate, all right? One is that anybody, and particularly Mr. Hitchens' argument, is sophistry. And what that is, it means that it sounds profound until you subject it to some real rigorous cross-examination, right? Second thing, but there's even a better term for it. There's a guy, a professor, philosopher at Princeton that just wrote a book called Bullshit, which is an even better description, all right? Especially read it and see how he describes it, right? The point is this, is that our democracy isn't. First of all, you see that pretty girl there? That's my daughter. And she's 20, and she's draft age. She has a twin brother who's draft age. I decide about whether or not I want to support a war based upon whether I'm willing to send them off to die or be maimed. George Bush, he think that Saddam Hussein represents such a danger to this country. Why don't you send his little daughters? All they do is run around and drink. Every time I see them, they partying somewhere. And it's these young people out here who are trying to make ends meet, who joined the National Guard, for crying out loud. That's what George Bush joined, the National Guard, to keep from going to the war. Now, he dare not bring back the draft because his daughter's name is Bush. That means they'll be at the top of the lottery. So they keep sending these poor young people back. They're people who've done 3 tours of duty in the National Guard. I've been in the military. Mr. Hitchens, have you ever been in the military? Because you're so willing to start wars and you're so happy about battle. Have you ever actually been in the military? Listen, I've not only been in the military.
I think the more appropriate question would be, have you ever been in the radio business? Because this is what this is about. This is not radio. This is a debate.
If it were radio, you wouldn't be here. So
Absolutely. And I want to take that point. I want to take that point and direct it to Mr. Hitchens, which is to say, let's not dealing with any of the points that you're accepting them all. At some point, however, what you do have to say in any war situation is are people willing to fight it? Are people willing to pay the price?
They're not willing. They're not willing.
Yes, I know. We know you know.
Right.
We know that's your point of view. Now we want to hear. We want to hear from the other side. We're trying to expose a contradiction here.
You said we could stop each other.
Yeah. At any rate.
Oh, okay. All right.
At any rate, Christopher, where does that bring you? If you look at this country, at some point, this country says, no, enough. What happens, and at what point? That may well be, but that's not the question. It's the question here. Don't you people know anything about a debate?
Well,
when
you're ready, I mean.
Excuse me?
When they're ready, or when you are.
Well, I am ready, please.
Okay, fine. Well, it's fallen to me to represent only the style of the pallid, epicene, faggy Anglo-Saxon inhabitants of a rain-sodden archipelago in the North Sea, and obviously you will make the allowance necessary to that. But, And it naturally, therefore, it's with extreme diffidence that I point out to Dr. Benjamin that during the time that Franklin Roosevelt committed the United States Army to war against fascism, African Americans were segregated in the armed forces, and not segregated but equal either. It didn't go to the justice of the war, however. Mr. Lincoln, who at this, I think, in this very hall, called the Union, the Union, half slave and half free. Of course, a huge presidential exaggeration. It was only about 10% slave, but people do tend to exaggerate in times of crisis. Allowed people in the Union service to pay others to take their place in the armed forces. It led to draft riots in New York in which many black orphanages were burned to the ground. I don't think it goes to the justice of the struggle against slavery, but I'm only trying to make distinctions here, and I hope without a complete absence of success. Now, we were told, I think, I certainly remember being told that this all depended on the United Nations, and that nothing not warranted by the UN could be just or justifiable. Let's not too hastily dismiss the United Nations in this, but I remind you, the United Nations had already accumulated a record of about 60 completely flouted and unenforced resolutions concerning not just weapons of mass destruction, but also Iraq's certification that it no longer supported terrorist groups, that it would give a list of the missing people of Kuwait. I'm sorry that Dr. Benjamin views the destruction of Kuwait and Kuwait society with such insouciance. Kuwait had given hospitality.
Don't give a shit about Kuwait.
Kuwait had given hospitality to above 250,000 Palestinian refugees, for example, and had allowed them to rebuild their lives in exile in Kuwait in a more exemplary way than almost any other Arab country. It had at least the lineaments of a free press. It did allow women to sit in parliament. I'm sorry if it doesn't meet the exacting conditions of some people, but it was a great deal better than living under the regime of Saddam Hussein. And that was a UN-mandated war, as you will recall, as is the current one. American and British soldiers and others, Danes, Poles, are in Iraq now on a UN mandate, passed by a very important resolution, which empowers the new and recognizes the new elected government of Iraq and calls on the international community to help with its reconstruction and to protect it from sabotage and terrorism in the meantime. I'm sorry to say, and I have to be mild in English about it, I fail to see the criminality of that enterprise.
I didn't say it was criminal. As a matter of fact, I said just the opposite. I said
you didn't say it was criminal.
The only reason why, listen, here's what I'm saying. I said I actually supported the Gulf Desert Storm because I was opposed to Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait, even though I don't give a damn about the Kuwaitis, is what I'm telling you. I'm saying I oppose it for the same reason I'm opposing America's invasion now of Iraq. Let me just say this, though. Look, I've read Mr. Hitchens' writings before this. I must admit, I've not read very many of his books because I'm constantly oppressed by, scholarly texts. Those of you who listen to my radio show know that, you know what I mean? So I'm always reading stuff. And I got so many serious historical texts about things that, I consider more immediate that I have not been able to read. But I've been reading some of his stuff before I came on here. And I came across a piece before the war where he was written in 2002. Where he was already cheering. In fact, he said that he was certain that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons. Let me just say this. I find the whole discussion about whether or not Saddam Hussein had a bomb to be obscene because I once had a top secret security clearance in the Strategic Air Command. Do you know how many bombs the United States got? I mean, really, do you know how, and do you realize that right now, these right here, there's some people sitting out there in a mountain, and not only just in a mountain, you can do it from any base because you got the red and the blue phones on every base. A half hour from now, the whole world could be a burnt out radioactive cipher because of the weapons that this country has. Do you know where germ warfare, where germs were first weaponized? In Fort Detrick, here. So to listen to this high-minded crap, about the United States, has some right, to say who can have a bomb and who can't. First of all, I didn't give a damn whether Saddam Hussein had a bomb or not. He ain't gonna drop it over here. You better be worried about, listen, I wrote a piece here before the war. Go online tomorrow to the Black World today and read it. It's called The Iraq Attack, Bush's March of Folly. Now, unlike Mr. Hitchens, who thought the war was a good idea, I thought it was bullshit. And I said so. And not only that, I also, in here, this is a learned treatise, you know, where I show why there couldn't possibly be any relationship between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Forgotten. But the point is this. The point is this. The point is this, is that you read it, it reads like prophecy. So y'all need to know something before we go on, since we're going to all be prognosticating and dropping all kind of esoteric, you know, stuff on you. You need to know who the real prophet is. I'm the one who got it right, okay? And if you want me to read it, I'll read it to you. So I brought it prepared to read it, okay? What he said and what I said. Now, the point is, his predictive powers right now are extremely suspect. And not only that, from all I can tell, he's going about faith-based analysis, even though he is, you know. The war in Iraq is a product of a group of crazy theorists who were in a think tank called the Project for a New American Century. And listen, and the only reason, listen, and the only, and I got all the documents and shit. I could show you step by step how the whole thing happened, starting it back in 1997, right? But I ain't gonna be able to do that. I can see that. And let me just say something about language so you all don't think I'm illiterate. Mr. Hitchens, in spite of his constant invective against the British Crown, faithfully observes the nuances and rules of the Queen's English all the time. I, however, agree with Mark Twain, Walt Whitman, Toni Morrison, Nobel Prize laureate, and Ralph Ellison, and Langston Hughes, that the American idiom is more expressive, especially since it has been constantly enriched by the Afro-American idiom. So I will be drifting in and out of the Afro-American idiom at will. Y'all feeling me? Hey, so I just want y'all to know that. But here's what I'm saying. This war, Mr. Hitchens wrote in one of his pieces here that I have here, Mr. Hitchens wrote that
may I interrupt? Questions. Let's
We're going to go to questions, and we're going to limit the answers to 5 minutes to each question, okay? Let's do that.
After he goes into
5 minutes.
3 minutes to each question. All right, you're first.
It's quite surprising. I think it's very important to have a sober and rational debate. But it's very surprising to me that, Christopher, you've managed to do almost an existential somersault, because on the one hand you point out quite rightly all the intransigences of the CIA and being lied to, and we all know that the first casualty of war is the truth. In fact, in Gulf War I, we were told that babies were thrown out of incubators, and in every war, in fact, we've been told lies to try and get us into a war mode. However, then you go along with the premise that, you know, we have to be scared about, we're scaring ourselves to death by this terrible threat of terror. And the problem is that when we go along with this idea that we've got all of these enemies to fear and we're going to be blown up by these mad mullahs, all we end up doing is stoking up anxiety and fear and panic, rather than having exactly what you're suggesting, a cold, rational, sober debate. And on both sides, calling people Nazis and fascists doesn't really clarify the specific nature of the situation at the moment. Much better to talk about the specific context. So my question is, are we not, to Christopher Hitchens primarily, are we not being, is it a very bad idea to be promoting fear and the obsession with terror over an objective discussion about what the real conditions are?
As it happens, the questioner is right that in the past, what I actually think of the Gulf War as having begun in '91 and having not yet ceased. My book about this is called A Long, Short War, The Postponed Liberation of Iraq. But if I accept your grammar, and we talk about the '91 war, it is true that it was falsely said that Kuwaiti babies had been dumped out of their incubators and that Saddam was going to move his troops across the Saudi Arabian border. I have no reason to believe either of those allegations was true, but I knew much worse about Saddam Hussein than the then Bush administration did, and had tried to publish it. And you know what? I don't require government permission to think something. And it doesn't change my mind if I see a Republican making a case in which I believe and making it badly. I can actually manage to live with that. And I can go and read the books, and I can go on the internet, and I can go and interview people, just as you all can, and come to your own conclusions, and not whine forever about, we were lied to, when you didn't repress. Yes, I think that's a cause for alarm. But I spoke much less loudly about this than my questioner, who was deafening in his refusal of fear and hysteria. Grow up, some of you, for heaven's sake. Now, a couple of things that I don't want anyone to say when this is over, which I hope it soon is, that I didn't answer a question or I refused a challenge. I had two from Dr. Benjamin. One was about the number of invasions conducted and foreign policy atrocities that could be laid to the account of the United States. Well, I don't expect him to have read my books, or you too. You either, I mean. If you care to look up my little book on Dr. Kissinger, you will find a fairly strong digest and compendium of the war crimes and crimes against humanity that American foreign policy has been responsible for, and a call also for those responsible to be placed on trial, which I think there's still a chance that Dr. Kissinger can. So I don't appear, as it were, in the character of an apologist for the American past. I rather like the change of policy. I prefer overthrowing dictators and starting elections to cancelling elections and installing dictators. Those of you who find this hard to understand will find it hard to understand. It's not my fault. And that I'm not at all an atheist, I'm an anti-theist. I believe religious belief is positively harmful. And that if I was an atheist, I'm not sure I'd be promoting a book that said, welcome to someone who'd left the Nation of Islam and gone back to the church. I mean...
It's not my story, it's his.
I know that, I heard that. Right. I listened to you, in fact.
Not my story, it's his.
Joining the church is generally a step down. I think leaving the Nation of Islam to join the church probably is a step up, but I mean, this is not...
But I would just like to, I must say something about that. You see this again when I'm talking about, I'm an atheist, but I have a lot of respect for the black church. The black church is a heroic institution. It produced Dr. Martin Luther King. It produced, if you look at the 19th century, virtually, and look at the 20th century, just the leadership, well, first of all, the black church would justify its existence just for the musicians it has produced. You understand what I'm saying? The great musicians. The black church is a marvelous institution, and I love it, and I support it. I just don't believe in God.
I have to do this. Just picture, ladies and gentlemen, if you would, if the pallid, pink, slumped, faggy Epicene Hitchens had got up and said, the thing about the black church is its wonderful sense of rhythm, I don't think you'd have applauded me.
Next question.
I wasn't going to try it either.
Next question.
Hi, my name is Priya, and I was invited here by Mr. Benjamin to make a brief statement on the situation of the Iraqi women. By the way, the reason Playthell should get to talk is because the corporate media in this country has already given a platform to Mr. Hitchens' point of view. You know, you mentioned Tim McVeigh, Playthell. He was a Gulf War vet. It's probably where he learned that killing innocent people was okay. But the situation for the women in Iraq is that they are fighting a theocratic, fascist Islamic state unleashed by the United States.
This is not a demonstration.
We have instituted Islamic Sharia in the Iraqi constitution.
It has not been agreed to hear statements. It has not been agreed to hear statements.
So these women are stuck between a brutal occupation and a fundamentalist theocratic regime.
Cut it off.
So that is not liberation.
All right, we're going to answer.
That's a delusion that you're trapped in.
All right,
Human
we're going to ask a question.
For America, I mean, the rights of caliber.
Out of order.
This is selfish to do that because this is
I'm not here to kiss your ass.
Scott,
I'm here
turn
to
that
convey
mic off.
a serious human rights crisis for
Can
women
you turn that mic off?
in Iraq, directly resulting from the policies that you support.
Out of order. Out of order.
It's not. The war is out of order.
Sit down. Out of order.
I just would like to ask a question.
Listen, I oppose the war, but we can't have a war in this room right now. We have to have a civil debate, all right? Let's have a debate here.
But listen, well, let me ask you a question. Have you ever seen the British House of Commons? It looks like the British House of Commons to me. That's what it looks. So we're having a
it's a bit different from that.
Nobody has pulled a knife on anybody yet. I haven't made any motion to strike Mr. Hitchens. We're just talking. What is everybody so uptight about? Let me just say this.
We're waiting for questions.
Somebody ought to say.
We're waiting for our questioners.
That what they. I have a copy of the Iraqi
waiting for our questioners.
Yes, sir. And women are going to get shafted in this situation, and somebody ought to say it. Somebody ought to say it.
Wait till we ask them.
Right. Listen, in this room right now, he is the underdog, all right? So we have to defer and not have this kind. I mean, in terms of people and their position, maybe 70 or 30. So let's go to questions right now. Let's go to questions. Question.
We got one guy here, man.
It's just a statement.
No.
It all depends on when I am going to ask
No,
a
it
question.
isn't.
But every question is prepped with a statement. The plumb line was dropped in the 1990s, but the plumb line is actually dropped in the 1886 Brussels-Berlin conference when it was decided that the borders of Iraq and Iran and Kuwait was taken away from Iraq. You drop it in 1991, you drop it in 79, but you drop it in 1886, and then in the First World War and the Second World War, where the British lost all their power, but the United States came up with power, understood the understanding of oil, and began to murder off a bunch of people. Now, my question is to you. If you drop the plumb line here, as Reverend James Montgomery would say, you drop the plumb line where you want to drop the plumb line and try to make a statement. We dropped the plumb line back when there was a power in the European nation trying to take over the oils and the rest of the damn lands and natural resources from the rest of the world.
Can we get to the question, please?
Which this country has built itself on the natural resources of others around the world. My question to you is,
yes.
I am.
Yeah, okay, fine.
The question to you is that why should we, as a nation, go in behind a president whose grandfather established monies and gave the weaponry to the Hitler regime itself and supported the Hitler regime to do what it did to establish this fascist system that now we're under?
Okay, well, that contains all the elements of an excellent question, and I commend it to emulators. And I love the historical dimension because it's very important. Here's the situation. Actually, the greatest thing, in my opinion, that the Bolshevik Revolution did in 1917 was to publish the secret treaties of what had formerly been its allied powers in the First World War, about what their negotiations would consist of and their demands would be at the end of it. And these included the Sykes-Picot agreement between Britain and France, which was planned to lead to a carve-up of the Middle East, so that France would have Syria and Lebanon, and Britain would have what had been the vilayets of Mosul, Kirkuk, and Basra of the Ottoman Empire. Those three vilayets together make up what we now call Iraq. But there was no Iraqi border to redraw before then, if you get my meaning. And the autonomy of Kuwait as a separate entity had been established long before the Iraqi borders were drawn. So, roughly speaking, it corresponded to what the Mesopotamian provinces of the Ottoman Empire had been, and it's a very unhappy border, and always was, including under Turkish imperialism. What you need to know about the response to Lenin's policy in this respect is the following. I mean, there are many things, but this is the relevant one. President Woodrow Wilson, on finding out that that's what his allies were doing in the region, proclaimed his 14 points, calling for national self-determination in the region. And he didn't feel he could join the First World War if it was so obviously an imperialist war as these disclosures had revealed. That's important because we're bound by that decision too. Those 14 points include a promise of self-determination to Iraq, to the Kurds, who'd been enclosed against their will within the Iraqi state, to the Armenians and to the Palestinians. It's very important. I think Americans are also, to some extent, morally bound by it. And the more one investigates this history, the more one realizes what the depth and length of our responsibility is. And that was the point I hoped to make this evening in the first place. This does not start with the project for the new American century or any of this paranoid garbage that you
This
hear.
war does.
No, excuse
this
me.
War
no,
does.
No,
this war does, and I can demonstrate
This war
does.
started in 1991. Now, just to the gentleman's last question, which I'm answering, why, therefore, does America, or does the United States and its people have the right to decide, as with the Senate resolution of 1998, on a policy of regime change? How can we do this if George Bush's grandfather was a Nazi? Well, now, ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to consider carefully. If George Bush's grandfather's Nazism means that we cannot stick up for human rights, and if we can't have a policy of our own that differs from his, we really would be on a Bush plantation, wouldn't we? And we're not. We have the right to say that we want to reverse the evil of past policies, and precisely the evil of those past policies redoubles our responsibility to correct them. If I have to say this again, I will feel I've been wasting my time, and even worse, yours. Thanks.
I just want to say one brief thing here, right now, right here. This particular war here, I would like to invite Mr. Hitchens. I have a 2-hour radio show. Come on and debate me about this. I would like us to go head to head about this war.
I already said yes.
And I will demonstrate to you all that this war is a result of all of these mad policy wonks There was look. What happened was the inmates took over the asylum. The same people who were writing all those papers that the George Bush Sr. called the crazies, and Colin Powell called the fucking crazies. These are the same people who ended up formulating all the policy of the Bush administration. And I can show you all the position papers, and you can see that that's exactly what happened. I have them here now, but I'm obviously not going to catch up. But
we probably have time for 2 more questions
and debate this.
Okay.
All right. If you believe.
Lenny Brenner.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I came in right after Christopher was talking, or right before, I should say. Christopher was dumping on Carter for his crimes. So I think there's a point of common agreement, basically, between the two of you, that the United States was Satan Bajorog, the great Satan, when it supported, when Jimmy Carter supported the Iranian Shah.
Yeah.
He was Satan, the great Satan, when he supported Saddam Hussein against Iran. He was great Satan when he supported the Islamic fundamentalists against the Stalinist regime in Afghanistan, which did have women's rights, etc., etc. The question is, Brother Christopher said he believes in alchemy, that somehow America went from bad to good, whereas he objects to being accused of faith-based politics. But alchemy and faith-based politics are the same. These guys, how did these guys go, how did the United States go from a rap sheet of crimes, which Christopher fully admits, to suddenly being the savior of Iraq, Afghanistan, throwing
That's the question.
Palestine?
That's the question. All right, come on.
Very welcome question, and I may say it's always an honor to be questioned by Lenny Brenner, who, in his aspect as well as in his record, shows the finest in the Trotskyist tradition, as well as its increasingly evident limitations. I'll have to do this quickly, and I'll do it like this. Picture, if you can, you should be able to by now, the figure of the current president of Iraq. I don't know if a picture comes into your mind of President Jalal Talabani. When I first met Mr. Talabani, he was living in a burned-out town in northern Iraq in 1991, just up the road from a town that had been burned out with chemical weapons, as a large part of the landscape had been, and was trying to organize a civilian and military resistance to the regime of Saddam Hussein, as he had been doing for many years. He's a very honored and respected nationalist and socialist and democrat in the region, with a very honorable tradition, and the only real people's army fighting in Iraq today. Don't believe what you hear about the so-called insurgents and the paid rabble of the Ba'ath Party and of Mr. Zarqawi's al-Qaeda organization. There is only one real insurgent people's army on Iraqi soil, and it's the Peshmerga of the Kurdish revolution, and it's a pleasure to be fighting on their side. Now, when I met Mr. Talabani that year, I would have given not much by way of odds that he would, by the year 2004, become the first democratically elected president of Iraq. The Iraqi people should have picked a man who was, until recently, the leader of an embattled minority that had suffered from genocide in our living and current memory, some of those weapons supplied by the United States, I might add. The leader of the party that in Iraq is the corresponding member, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, of the Socialist International, the international that Lenny doesn't support, and actually neither particularly do I, but is the one that links the social democratic parties of Europe and Africa and the Middle East. Are you going to say that Iraq is occupied by its own inhabitants when they elect a man of this caliber and quality, who any European country would be proud to have? If you don't recognize that that's a change of policy, you don't recognize changes of policy when you see them, and that's that.
We have a question for Mr. Benjamin here.
I would like to ask a question.
Anybody have a question for Mr. Benjamin?
First, I would like to ask Mr. Hitchens a question.
For Playthell.
Yeah, listen, I want to ask Mr. Hitchens a question first. Mr. Hitchens, I've heard you talk about the Peshmerga, many times, and, the Iraqi, the Kurdish, but I just got through reading the Iraqi Constitution, and I see where they're going to have one army, period, in this new Iraq, which has to happen because no state can survive unless the state has a monopoly on organized violence. That is the nature of all power. I mean, legitimate governments must have certain support among the people, but in the end, the government must have a monopoly on coercive forces, that is the use of organized violence. So what's going to happen to the Peshmerga now in this new Iraqi state? I mean, a lot of Kurds don't want to be a part of a unitary state with the Arabs, but what do you think is going to happen?
Well, you're asking me. Well,
yeah.
Let me just inflate my lungs to their fullest extent. This chance may not come again. In my opinion, humble as it is, insular as it no doubt is, the Kurdish people of the region, who are the largest people in the world not to have a state of their own, the royal family of Qatar has its own seat at the United Nations. It's an extraordinary. The people that we think not less than 35 to 40 million Kurds of Turkey, Syria, Iran, Lebanon, and Iraq don't have a representation of any kind. I believe they have the right to secede from the countries that enclose them and to declare a state of their own. Their claim to self-determination in the area is the oldest, is the most just cause in the region, predates the struggle of Palestine, and is the longest cause of the left in the Middle East, for those of you who don't know this. But I say to my Iraqi Kurdish friends at present, who I talk to almost every day, and who are doing the work, they're doing our fighting for us. They're killing the Al-Qaeda people in Iraq. They're fighting for us as they were when they were fighting against Saddam Hussein. And it's an honor, as I say, and it's a source of pride to be fighting with such people in the same trench. I say to them, and they agree, now would not be the time to secede from Iraq. Maybe in the future, when the region has composed itself a little, and when the fascists have been beaten, we might discuss a redrawing of the borders, but to demand to secede from Iraq now is extraordinary and would be extreme, and that they take that view. They serve in the government, they serve in the army, they've given one of their favorite and most brilliant sons to the presidency. These people are fighting for an Iraq that was poisoning them and their children from the air only a decade ago. It's asking a lot of them. Don't condescend. Don't condescend to them, okay? I won't have that.
One final question.
Hi. Mr. Benjamin, earlier you were mentioning how popular World War II was, and certainly we were fighting against a man who, in your words, could certainly have taken over the world.
Do you doubt it?
I'm not doubting that at all, but I think it's very interesting to point out, though, that the year of D-Day, that fully 40% of this country still favored a negotiated peace with Adolf Hitler. And that fact, seen in today's context, and certainly in the polarizing media climate that we live in today, isn't it true that A, we can never have a truly popular war in America, and B, that just because a war isn't popular with a large section of Americans, that it's not necessarily an incorrect fight?
Let me say this. First of all, World War II, listen, you say 40%, I don't know, I think World War II is about as popular as war is going to get. The question, listen, the question is not whether this war is popular. The question is that listen, no, okay, but I'm saying that's not the question for me, all right? That's not what I'm concerned with, all right? What I'm concerned with is the fact that a crime was committed, that the President of the United States went before the Congress and lied. He knew when he said this that what he was saying wasn't true. All right, listen, if you don't think he knew it, listen, if y'all don't think he knew it, I tell you what you do. Tomorrow, go to the Black World Today, tbwt.org, and read my piece and see that I describe everything that they now admit, right? Right down to saying that if you want to look for nuclear weapons, go to Pakistan. I said this before the war. Now I'm swift on the cap, but damn, I ain't that smart. You think that I could figure this out? Me, a lone colored man working with one little computer up in Harlem, and Bush got $44 billion worth of intelligence and he couldn't figure it out? It's bullshit. He lied. So it's a crime. He should be right now impeached. And if the Democrats win the House, he will be impeached because the chairman of the committee, whether you like it or not, John Conyers, has already written a book which is coming out stating the case for impeachment, and he will be the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. I think a crime was committed, and not only I think a crime was committed here, and I think a crime was committed in international law. He says that Iraq, forfeited their sovereignty. Everything that he said about Iraq is the United States has been guilty of in its history and worse. You understand? So if their sovereignty should be forfeited, so should this country's sovereignty.
Can I consider that your closing statement?
I don't know. I will make the closing statement when it's over. All right? When you get ready to leave. All right, go ahead.
Well, just to the last question, if I may.
I don't even understand the question.
I'm not sure the question was specifically for me, but with your permission, because it helps me answer an earlier question about the culture of fear. I don't think there was the smallest chance of Adolf Hitler taking over the world, not even with the support of Japanese and Italian imperialism. I think fascism was absolutely doomed to defeat because it was based on an irrational, racist, mania, paranoia theory and behaved in a self-destructive manner. But it didn't
stop American slavery from lasting 250 years, and it was based on the same thing. Same ideology.
But it did have to be fought.
The same ideology.
It did have to be fought and resisted. It's because I'm sure that the same will be true of the irrationality and mania of Islamic jihadism, that there can only be one outcome to a war. I must remind Dr. Benjamin that he said about the jihadists that they were fighting against European colonialism and its legacy. I think you'd have a hard time selling that to the people of Afghanistan, half of whom were immediately put under slavery, the female half by the Taliban, the rest of whom had to live under the direst poverty and repression, where even music and reading were abolished. If you want to ask yourself what the Islamic jihadists have in store for you, look what they did to the people of Afghanistan. Look what they did to the Shia minority, the Hazara tribe of Afghanistan.
Let me just explain
wiped them out. Now,
I'm not an apologist.
Fascism has to be fought, but it doesn't mean we have to be impressed by it, or those who euphemize it either, and use soft words to describe nasty things. Okay? That's all I wanted to say.
I'm not an apologist for the Islamic jihadists.
Yes,
I agree with Frantz Fanon. The setting up of an Islamic state is a return to primitive medievalism, all right? I'm not in any way a supporter of Islam. You understand? So don't, mistake me for a supporter of Islam.
So the jihadists were anti-colonialists?
Yeah, I'm not. There's 1 million black slaves in the Islamic world right now, all right? I've been to meetings, with the abolitionists. I've heard Arab slave owners today talk about, and I'll tell you one thing, Stanley Crouch was there, he's in here, we were up at Columbia at one of these anti-slavery meetings with all these Arab former slaveholders was getting up saying, how sorry they were. But they said, one guy said he lived all over the Arab world, and everywhere he went there were black slaves, except in Iraq, because Saddam Hussein abolished slavery while he was there with his father, who was a diplomat. All these other states have black slaves. I'm not any friend of the Muslims, so that's, don't put that on me.
The quality of the unproductiveness of this discussion has been unrivaled, certainly in my moderating experience, and I would love to bring this to a close.
One of the reasons why it's been unproductive is because you interject yourself into it too much. You should have just let me and him go at each other.
Perhaps. Mr. Hitchens, would you like to a closing statement?
I sense that the demand for it is somewhat slack. As is my willingness to... I think I'd be repeating myself. I think I've been reviewing it in my mind. I think I made the points I wanted to make, sometimes twice. I think I'd be boring you, and even worse myself, if I went on this way. I just think, though, because I agreed so much with what Playthell Benjamin just said about the urgent question of slavery and genocide of black Africans at present at the hands of Islamic jihadists, not just in Mauritania and other countries, but in Darfur, in southern Sudan. Am I to take it, I must ask this question to the audience, really. It's a rhetorical question, if you will, but I'll ask it obviously to you too, sir. That if the United States government did what many of us in Washington have been urging it to do, and to intervene in Darfur against slavery and genocide against black Africans, would you set up the cry, we had no right to do this because we once invaded Nicaragua? Would that be all you could say if we decided to help our African brothers and sisters from genocide and slavery? There seem to be people who said, if I wasn't wrong, there were fools in this audience who applauded sentiments like that a few moments ago. I just think you should hear what your own arguments sound like when they're played back to you. I think you deserve that. But don't worry, we didn't do that in Darfur. We said we'll do it Kofi Annan's way this time. Didn't we? And we negotiated the time away, and we gave them all the time in the world. And we invited French and German envoys and inspectors, and the killers used up the time, and you know what? It's too late now. You can stop worrying about Darfur. They've all been killed. They've all been killed, so it's just as well. It's just as well the neocons never got a look in, isn't it? There you are. I would hold the mic up so you could be better heard if I could. You deserve it. Good night now.
Mr.
That's all I want to say.
Mr. Benjamin, perhaps you also feel that you have made your points and do not want a closing statement.
No, absolutely, I do not feel like I've made my points because I came here. Listen,
how surprising!
Listen.
I have the same feeling.
I came here to. Here's what I came here to do. I came here to do two things: to demonstrate, with the documents, you see, that this war was cooked up in a think tank and carried out by the people who ran. Most of these people in these think tanks stay in think tanks. But when George Bush chose...
Now, I'm sure you said this before. I will stake my life on it.
You know what?
It was in the laboratory of Yakub, I think.
You're the most intrusive moderator I've ever seen in my life. I mean, really, I don't understand it.
But am I correct?
Do you want me to talk or not?
I would prefer that you did talk.
Why don't you just shut up and let me say what I'm saying, all right? Why don't you do that, right?
Well, you don't mind if the rest of us go.
That's one point I want. The other point I wanted to make is
we leave?
I wanted to have a scientific discussion of the nature of mass movements to show that what the United States is doing is in fact creative. Get on out of here. Get on out of here. Hey, listen. I want you all to know this ain't the first time somebody got up and ran out. You know what I mean? They did it on the radio. And get up and run out of it on the radio. You know what I mean? Yeah. I yank your
Thanks,
butt, but they
everybody.
can't